Hello, my name is Teona Dimova. I'm a Bulgarian actress, and I am very honored to be reading to you the play called My Tara by Ludmila Timoshenko. I hope I'm saying that right. It is translated from Ukrainian by John Freedman with Natalie Bratus. There is a scene in Gone with the Wind, the funeral of Geralt, Scarlett's father. Before closing the coffin, Will asks Scarlett to go into the house, saying she is pregnant and might lose her child in the heat. The old woman accompanying her says, "He just didn't want you to hear the coffin being nailed shut." And he's right. Remember, Scarlett, until you hear that sound, the person seems alive to you. But as soon as you hear, yes, it is the most frightening sound in the world. It is the sound of the end. I was 12 years old when I read these lines. At that time, I lived with my grandmother Tanya in Ovrich, in the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine. When I was 7 months old, my parents had sent me from North Kazakhstan, which is where I was born, to live with her. My father served in the strategic rocket forces. What does that mean? When rockets were placed on combat duty, they had to be kept under constant control. They were guided via underground command posts, and they were called Satan warheads, the largest nuclear rockets of the time. There were 24 of them in my dad's garrison. Officers sat underground, keeping constant watch over these rockets. Every officer on duty knew if he were to receive the order, he would have to press a button. There were 3 types of readiness. Number 1 was constant combat readiness, whereby a green signal light was constantly on the bunker. Number 2 was increased combat readiness, which was accompanied by a blue light. The third was engagement danger. For this, a red light was lit, and the officer on duty would turn on all devices that eventually would direct the warheads toward their target. All that was left was to push the red button. The officer on duty knew that by pushing the button, he would destroy a city 10 times the size of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. I was sent from North Kazakhstan to live with my grandmother in Ukraine because the climate in Kazakhstan is not suitable for a 7-month-old child. 10 months of winter and the rest is summer, as the locals joked. 40 below in winter, plus 40 in summer. I was often ill. My older brother, Serhiy, stayed with our parents. He, a 5-year-old boy, was very scared. Like all Soviet children living in such military bases, he feared nuclear war. At the age of 5, he knew perfectly well what was unauthorized behavior. That topic was constantly discussed among parents, kindergarten teachers, neighbors, shop assistants, and even hairdressers in beauty shops. The officers on duty were usually men of strong endurance and iron-clad psyche. From time to time, however, their nerves might crack. The nerves they experienced in the control room, starting at the color of the signal light, made some of them go crazy. Mental aberrations like this had to be detected or foreseen in some way. Otherwise, this so-called unauthorized behavior might actually transpire. That is, if a duty officer realized he had the power to flatten planet Earth all on his own. He might succumb to the nation. He could do anything he pleased. Such system failure may occur not only in a particular person's head, but also in the banker's control system. There once was an accident when something went haywire and the red signal light came on completely by accident. While the officer on duty, sweating with animal terror, aimed the rocket at its target, the command center managed to issue the proper directives to rescue the order. I was not afraid of nuclear war because I lived with my grandmother. She ate dumplings with cherries in summer and mashed potatoes with gravy in winter. My grandmother took me sledding, drove me to see the New Year's Eve tree, and every Victory Day on May 9th, we would attend the parade of flags, rejoicing at the peaceful sky over our heads and our victory over fascism. My grandfather died in 1958. During World War II, he fought on various fronts repairing military aircraft. He met my grandmother in Germany, where, like many girls, she had been transported by train from Ukraine and forced to work in German factories. After the war, my grandmother and grandfather, along with my father's newborn older brother Valery, named after test pilot Valery Chkalov, moved to a garrison in Belarus in the city of Baranovichi. When my dad, Victor, was 9 years old, his father died. Over the Easter holidays, Grandpa went from Belarus to his native village in the Zhytomyr region and got caught up in the tradition of going house to house. That is when on holidays, from morning to night, villagers visit their neighbors and drink moonshine. He then returned to his family in Baranovichi and died of a stroke. He so missed my grandmother that immediately upon arrival, he climbed up on top of her and his heart burst. He was 38 years old. My grandmother, my father, and his brother Valery remember the sound of the nails being driven into the coffin. 8 months after my grandfather's death, grandmother decided to return to her relatives in Ukraine. She and her 2 sons were given a room in a communal house in the town of Ovrich. Grandfather's family asked for permission to transport his body to his native village near Ovrich, and to make this happen, Grandma sold her last valuable possessions: a war trophy, a German accordion captured during the war. The coffin was dug up, covered with fir branches to hide the smell of the corpse, and was reburied in Grandpa's hometown cemetery. To this day, Dad can smell the smell of pine needles. Then my grandmother was given the house where I had to come to live from North Kazakhstan when I was 7 months old, and where I lived until I was 8, at which time my parents took me to Lviv. This red brick house was the happiest place I have ever known. On every school holiday, I flew there on wings. Actually, I traveled by way on the Lviv-Lugansk railway with a train change in Korosten. I have always strongly associated the smell of the jasmine growing near the house with the beginning of everlasting happiness. School would end on May 25, and on the 26th of May, I would luxuriate in the smell of the white flowers from the bush. There would be 3 months of wonderful, carefree time ahead of me. That summer I received a 2-volume edition of Gone with the Wind as a gift. This book was in short supply, and to get it you had to turn in more than 20 kilos of waste paper. I imagined myself as Scarlett O'Hara, and I saw my grandmother's house as Tara. A whole new wonderful world opened up for me. The parts about the war bored me, but I reread the parts about Scarlet and Red many times over. When I read those lines about the sounds of the end, I was frightened for the first time in my life. I realized that one day my grandmother would die and I would hear those sounds. Fortunately, that didn't happen until I was 40. My grandmother outlived her husband by 53 years, and when she was buried in the family cemetery in the village, the locals said they still remembered Grandpa's coffin, which had been lined with fir branches. Grandma died at the age of 92. The woman who dressed her in her funeral gown tied up her open jaw with a handkerchief. They pulled the knock so hard that grandmother smiled in her coffin. I was prepared for the sound of the nails going into the coffin. I was not ready for the sounds of rockets flying over Kyiv at 5 a.m. on February 24th. I was not ready for the sound of the air raid siren outside the window of my Kyiv apartment. I was not ready for my mother to spend 8 days under fire in occupied Irpin without water, gas, electricity, or mobile communications until she was evacuated. Most of all, I was not ready for several shells to explode 300 meters from my grandmother's house in Overich, where my father Victor now lives. Our neighbors' houses were completely destroyed, and the roof of my childhood home was partly blown off, while all the windows were blown out. Dad called me and said, "Luda, listen to this sound." It was the sound of my Tara's windows being hammered shut with boards and hardboards. It was the true sound of the end, for which I was not prepared. I was not afraid at the age of 5, but now I am afraid of nuclear war, because the president of Russia, the country that attacked my Ukraine, shows all signs of that unauthorized behavior. I am afraid of falling asleep and never waking up. My brother Serhiy, who is currently a surgeon in a 24-hour duty in a hospital in Kyiv, told me in North Kazakhstan, every adult and child knew what that hand was. That was a system that could launch rockets at the enemy without human intervention. Even if a nuclear strike in our direction had been inflicted earlier. As such, there was nothing to fear. But fuck knows if anything can stop it. Postscript. My dad's brother, my uncle Valery, named after the great test pilot Valery Chkalov, now lives in Bransk in Russia. He and his family consider us fascists, and they support the Russian president in the war. This was written on 10th of March 2022.